Welcome to this talk, Recommendations to the Benefit of Transgender Children in View of Legislative, Familial and Cultural Support. My name is Helge Sune Nyman and I'm the Vice Chairperson in the Association Support of Transgender Children, FSTB of Denmark. We have a strong panel of experts to explore the various sides of this topic, and I'm keen to pass on the word to them in a minute. We know from research and many personal stories that transgender and gender diverse children and youth face serious risk of marginalization, discrimination, and even exposure to violence. We also, as a result, see higher risks to suffer from depression and anxiety compared to non-transgender persons. Obviously, we find that family, parents, and guardians play an important role in improving the situation for these children, as do access to healthcare and legal protection. The good news is also that we, from research and experience on a more concrete level, know how to support these children so that they can live their lives in peace with their gender identity. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the word to our international experts for them to explore this topic.
Thank you, Helge. I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the people of the Kulin Nations, the traditional owners on the land on which I'm speaking today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And this land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge that here in Australia, we do have a level of support for our children that perhaps is greater than some other places in the world, and we are grateful for that, but there is always room for improvement, of course. So I thought I'd use my time to raise the voices of some of those transgender children, using my time on the panel to do that. So I've rounded up some quotes from some of the children that we support. I volunteer for an organisation in Australia called Parents of Gender Diverse Children, and we support families and primary caregivers who parent trans and gender diverse children throughout Australia. So I asked for some quotes, and I've chosen some from around Australia to give people an idea of what's going on in terms of access to healthcare and identity documents in different parts of Australia and how that's working. So I thought I'd start off with a 12-year-old girl in Western Australia who says, "I'm really thankful that I've been able to access medical treatment and I'll be able to start blockers soon." So she's able to start blockers at the appropriate Tanner stage for her, and that's been really good for her mental health. She's had great access to healthcare. However, I'm worried about some of my friends who aren't able to access the same medical treatment as a result of huge waiting times. So the wait lists over in Western Australia are very large. So she's really sweet and she's concerned about her friends. And I have a quote from a man aged 20 in New South Wales. So he can give us a really good perspective on what things were like for him and how things may have changed. And he says, and I'd like to give here a trigger warning as well, because from now on, some of these quotes will discuss suicide and suicide ideation. So I just want to give some people a minute to perhaps think about tuning out for a while, because I think it's really important that these voices are heard, but that can be a bit triggering for some people who are perhaps in our audience. Okay, I'll proceed. He says he's 20 now, and I just want to begin by saying he's in a really great place. He has a career now, a career path that he loves. He's doing a job that he loves, and he's really happy. So he says, "I didn't have the words to verbalize who I was until puberty was well underway. When I was a teen, I had to go to court to access hormones. Even though I had the support of both my parents, I thought it was ridiculous that I had to get a judge to approve my puberty when none of my cisgender peers did. If I hadn't had the opportunity to have top surgery when I was 15, I would have committed suicide. And I had to go to court, and my mum had to fight really hard for this. If I'd had the opportunity to have blockers, this would have saved me most of my junior high school being skipped, and I could have been just like my peers instead of spiraling into depression. I don't ever want to visit births, deaths, and marriages again. That's where we go to change our identity documents like birth certificates, as I found the process to be highly traumatic. Trans youth who don't have actively supportive parents or adults in their lives would never be able to navigate birth, deaths, and marriages due to it being such a traumatic process. It's worth pointing out that there are many places in Australia where you can now change your gender and your name, and it's a really lovely, smooth process. However, New South Wales is still not one of those places. And also I have a quote from a child in Victoria. She says, my family moved from this girl is 12. My family moved from New South Wales to Victoria to access better health care for me. That was so important for me. I feel lucky. Without it, I'd feel trapped in my body. I don't think life would be bearable. My mental health would suffer even more, as going through changes would destroy me. I feel grateful and blessed to have this health care, but I don't like some of the questions I have to answer, like whether I want children or what colour and clothes I like, and whether I like rough play with my siblings. Sometimes they feel really stereotyped. And her mother's given a quote as well. They moved from New South Wales to Victoria because at that time, New South Wales didn't have good healthcare for trans children. It does now. It has a fabulous new clinic that's really, really wonderful. But my daughter transitioned at age 8. She was relatively happy, although dealing with daily minority stress. But as puberty approached, I felt like I was losing her. Her depression and anxiety were out of control. The day she started blockers, I got my daughter back. I think that is very typical of what we tend to see with a lot of young people, an increasing anxiety when it comes close to puberty and the immediate relaxation once they're on blockers and getting on with their lives. I think that's very, very important, and brings me to this next quote, which is from a non-binary young person who's 14 in Victoria. According to their parent, they're feeling very helpless, as a waiting list means they've missed out on blockers and may not be able to begin accessing healthcare for at least another 18 months. This is the quote from that child. I feel like this is going to take too long. I feel like no one cares. The waiting lists are too long, and I'm not going back to school until someone can help me. And then I'll end with one more quote from a non-binary young person, again in Victoria. This person has access to excellent healthcare and has family support. And they say, I feel like having a biological child is not the most important thing. Actually, parenting a child is much more important than the fact that the child is made from my sperm. And I think that's indicative of a lot of our children feeling very, very pressured to talk about their fertility options and feeling that their healthcare that they need is much, much more important than their future fertility, that they feel there's many ways they can have a child rather than be a biological parent. And I'd like to end on this note. This is another quote from that same 12-year-old non-binary child. Why is gender a thing, and what's the actual point of it? I thought that was really cute. So they are the quotes that I've chosen, and I think they're very, very typical of some of the things that we're seeing around Australia. So where we have no waiting lists and the children can access blockers, we have much happier children. We have a lot of, especially assigned female at birth children who are missing out on that blocker period. Blockers are more readily given to assigned male at birth children past puberty, where they're much harder to get for assigned female children here. So there's a lot of anxiety around that age group. A lot of anxious people wanting top surgery under the age of 18 and feeling like they can't get on with their lives. That's how we are in Australia at the moment. A lot of children very, very happy now that they don't have to go to court unless they don't have both parents in agreement. And you can see that was a very, very traumatic process when we had to go through that.
I know that you've done a bit of research on quality of life for these children and their families, and also a bit about some numbers on who they are and how they see themselves. Can you elaborate a bit on that report?
So the Trans Pathways report was done by the Telethon Kids Institute in Western Australia by some amazing people over there. They're fantastic over in Perth. That was a really fantastic report that gave us a look at what trans and gender diverse young people are doing in Australia. One of the really interesting things to come out of that was that almost half of trans and gender diverse young people in Australia identify as non-binary, which is pretty much reflected in what we're seeing in parents of gender diverse children. So I'd say, about 45% of the families who are referred to us have non-binary children. And that's evident in sort of the schools that we're seeing too, probably have even greater numbers of non-binary students in our secondary schools as well, greater numbers than we see. Also, because a lot of those children don't need our support. Very, very interesting research there. One of the really sad things to come out of that, but also not surprising, was that if trans young people are not well supported, I think it was something, I haven't got the exact figures on me, but I think it was something like 48.6% of those young people will have suicide ideation. Wasn't unfortunately surprising, but also very, very sad. I definitely recommend everyone have a look at the Trans Pathways report out of Telethon Kids in Western Australia.
What recommendations can you make?
I think I'd first of all say what I've always said, and that's listen to the children. Number one, listen to the children, listen to what they are saying. It's their bodies and their lives that we're talking about, first of all. Secondly, I'd say, look what's working. Look at what is making these children happy. Look at what is making them thrive, and look at what is not. And it's pretty simple. So we've got some models here that are really working, and look at the real research that's being done around the world. We've got some incredible research that's being done around the world that you could really point to. And that's a fabulous thing to be able to do. All these wonderful healthcare workers and doctors doing this amazing research that you can point to if you really want these children to thrive and you really want to listen to these kids. It's there, you just have to look.
Evening, everyone. My name is Akani Shimange. My pronouns are they and them. I'm the Executive Director of Madimba, an organization that works with trans youth in South Africa. So as an organization, we have existed for the last 2 years. We do a lot of, our initial work was basically research around the needs of trans youth. And we run support groups. We do a lot of school policy reform. And so we also work with parents and caregivers of trans and gender expansive children across the country. So I think as a country, our situation is not unique. Trans people have always existed in the margins of society. The trans youth, I think, exist in the peripheries of even that. So a lot of research, a lot of work has not been done around them. There isn't, our current access to legal gender recognition does not actually state how minors can access legal gender recognition. So it has kind of left that open to interpretation. And has allowed, depending on which office you go change your gender marker at, to choose what the prerequisites are for youth. Access to healthcare has also been a difficult thing due to the age of consent, which is actually interesting because the age of consent for a number of medical interventions is, I believe, 12, but it seems like for gender affirming healthcare is 18. So trans youth don't really have access to gender affirming healthcare. It's usually trans youth that are privileged in some manner because they can only access gender healthcare in the private sector at absorbent prices. And so if we were to bring it back to the basics of it, is that trans youth, trans minors in this country don't really have access to legal gender recognition or healthcare, and those who have accessed it have had to kind of negotiate it or had their parents do it for them. So when it comes to the quality of life, it is directly proportional to family support. Trans children who have their family support are well adjusted in school. They have access to a number of services, seem to get less bullied, less ostracized. And children who don't have the support of their families will possibly drop out of school, won't access gender family healthcare, which has a number of ripple effects: heightened dysphoria, heightened anxiety, depression, and will possibly, I think we all know the statistic of trans youth and suicide. Without support, I think that is heightened across the board.
I know that you have done a bit of research on these people and how to improve their lives. Can you tell us a bit about your research?
So in the last 2 years, we've done 3 research papers. Basically 2. The other was to inform the other 2. The first one was a needs analysis across the country. The second was legal gender recognition. And the third was access to education. And interestingly enough, all the recommendations of legal gender recognition and access to healthcare, access to education, as much as there are government recommendations, a lot of it is recommendations to parents, to primary caregivers around support, around using the right names, the right pronouns, creating spaces that see these children and know them, mainly because when even if a child walks through the world that doesn't recognize them or doesn't use the right name or the right pronoun, it seems that even their depression and anxiety decreases if their parents or their primary caregivers do that work with them. And so, and this seems to come up continuously when a lot of our research required conversations with children, and you could tell as they explained that even though at school they won't let me use my real name, the fact that I come home and my mother uses it is enough, and I'm willing to go back to school the next day. Children who do not have that space at home, even if they just have it at school, if the school were to recognize them, they seem to still not be more well adjusted. So there is a direct link to family support and these children doing better at school, doing better at sports, growing up to be well-adjusted adults, etc.
So what are the points that you would like to, if I was a politician or lawmaker, what would you tell me to go about and do to increase the chances that these young people all could end up in the positive category?
I think on a basic level, it would be making or putting into law legal gender recognition acts that come from a place of self-identification and are not medicalized or not vetted by any other society, because legal gender recognition is a matter of dignity, and it is a gateway to access every other rights, right, access rights to education, to privacy, to housing, etc. Outside of legal gender recognition, we are leaving trans people, and from a very young age, outside of society and not being able to function within society. I think secondly, it would be putting, I think a lot of schools and a lot of education systems have laws around bullying, but it is never written in that homophobia and transphobia is a form of bullying and should be given the same attention as any other version of bullying, considering the dropout rates of transgender and gender expansive children. Also, the shift of trans healthcare, gender affirming healthcare being a basic need and not a cosmetic surgery or I think across the world it has been put into so many categories that are definitely not it. But also that trans people, like every other person in society, should just be given the same rights.
Hi everyone, I'm Ghassan Kassasia. I'm the Legal Director at Equality Australia, a national organisation in Australia working for LGBTI plus equality. So we're seeing concerted political, legal and policy efforts to undermine measures that support LGBTIQ plus people, but most critically for trans, gender diverse young people in healthcare and in education. We've seen imported agendas in the form of proposed legislation, political action and policy change that attempt to deny the existence of trans and gender diverse people in schools and that undermine their access to gender affirming healthcare. We're also seeing in Australia the rise of religious freedom being used as a guise for allowing discrimination. And in particular, with the conservative religious right, we've seen them shift their focus from same-sex marriage and families to now more about conversion practices. So practices that attempt to change or suppress particularly young LGBT people and towards gender-affirming healthcare, often relying on references to parental rights as being a reason to deny care to young people. Actually, I think Tavistock unfortunately has had a disproportionate impact on trans rights globally, and perhaps more than the case actually deserves, given that it was followed by a case not that long after it, which reaffirmed that parents had the ability to consent to treatment for their children, which that following case really reflects the law, for example, in Australia, which is that you need the consent of both parents, generally speaking, for treatment for children under 18 when it comes to gender affirming care. Tavistock, I mean, it has problematic reasoning. I think it has a questionable application of law. It's under appeal, and yet we saw it raised in Australia when we had a debate in one of our states around banning conversion practices. And so they used Tavistock to show that parents should have a right to deny their trans kids, particularly affirming healthcare, and that the concern was that that would be considered a type of conversion therapy. And the other example we've seen is a federal debate around in our federal parliament around a motion to deny gender affirming healthcare, relying on Tavistock directly as why we should ban it in Australia. That motion wasn't successful, but it shows that Tavistock is being looked at as sort of the first of credible decisions and jurisdictions where we'd expect laws to be in a different direction. And so it from that perspective, it has had a really negative impact on at least the political debate, even if it hasn't had a legal effect in Australia.
How do you see we can use laws then to improve quality of life for trans people? And what do you see are the pitfalls that we should be aware of?
Yeah, so I mean, there's certainly invoking human rights principles or discrimination laws can be used very strategically, in that for example, the right to non-discrimination and the right to non-discriminatory access to healthcare and services is a general principle that sits in our discrimination law framework. It sits in international human rights principles. And so you can rely on those principles to craft arguments and advocate for better access, timely access and free access to healthcare for trans youth. In Australia, we've generally seen that happen because we don't have a Bill of Rights nationally. We've got some state kind of protections, and then it's it's a patchwork of systems. We see incremental reform, and that means the real benefit of stories being the driver for change. So people who are willing to take their cases forward in either the press or in courts or in the political sphere to really drive that push for change. In terms of, so I think we can see that the law work in that way and the best law is when that lived experience is expressed in the way that we decide cases or make new laws or influence and advocate for change in policy reform. But on the negative side, I think the pitfalls are, picking the wrong cases to go first. And so, like with Tavistock, you see a very adverse decision that in fact impacts on many people in respect of a scenario that while we can empathize with the situation that person brought forward to the court, it set a principle that really affected many people who were never before the court to have their stories heard. And so the law can be very double-edged if it's not used strategically, and if the wrong people if the wrong people are in the room, and if the people who should be in the room aren't allowed in the room. And so that's the real challenge. And when I read the Tavistock decision, for example, and I think about the evidence that was accepted and the evidence that was rejected, and which evidence was given weight, the evidence that was missing, all of those things are potential pitfalls. And the issue with most cases where you're driven by interests that you owe to your particular client is you don't necessarily see the big picture of the impact of your advocacy in that space alone. So that can be some of the pitfalls. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the way effectively we've had change in Australia is the mixture of political advocacy and community-based advocacy, which involves a lot of people sharing stories and telling the public and MPs, our members of parliament, what their concerns are, coupled with kind of legal and policy and clinical experts that talk about the solutions that are possible for those issues. And that broader debate and discussion happening, it can be slow, but when the change happens, it can be more long-lasting because we've had a longer kind of arc to get there than, say, some places where the legal infrastructure is much more progressive, and so you can simply just take a case, get it decided, and it shifts the debate. We don't have quite a similar culture in Australia, and so debates shift very glacially, but when they shift, they tend to stay there. So we don't see the back and forth as much.
What do we see are the coming challenges, and do you see hope for improvement?
Yeah, I think there's some really big challenges, particularly in our work that we've seen with trans and gender diverse people in areas like sport and healthcare. Sport in particular, we're seeing a range of ideas come up around fairness, and one of those is the idea of difference in stamina or physicality that might mean a lack of fairness for particularly in women's sports. So we've also seen, you know, an interesting convergence of political values together. So we've seen the religious right come out with radical feminists who are sort of usually on polar opposites of the political spectrum, but aligned in their views on some of the trans inclusion. So I think that's where the challenges are in this area. But I think there's also great hope that comes from the visibility and the greater understanding that we're seeing around trans issues. I mean, in Australia, we've just had this massive debate around things like gender recognition, around conversion practices, around access to healthcare. And while we're seeing a lot more trans voices represented, it's partly because we're seeing all those trans voices that we're seeing some of the pushback around. We've got a bill in one of our states which is proposing to deny the existence of trans and gender diverse kids in schools. So that's an example. But that's only come about as a reaction to the fact that trans and gender diverse kids in schools are increasingly more visible and affirmed. So it's, you know, we're having some debates now in Australia that we had about gay and lesbian people about 20, 30 years ago. So they're the shoots of growth, that the more the backlash, provided it's strategically responded to, the more it actually shows that we're making an impact in changing attitudes and moving to a world where, you know, everyone is treated equally and everyone has a place in their family, in their society, in their workplace, wherever it is that they are.
Hi everyone, I'm Annie Pauline Saint-Fasson. I am speaking to you from Montreal, Canada. I am a professor at the University of Montreal, and I'm also the holder of the Canada Research Chair on Transgender Children and Their Families. So today I would like to talk to you about two things. First of all, the access to gender affirming care in Canada, but I'm going to focus specifically on Quebec today because each provinces have got different model of care, and so since I'm based in Montreal, I'm going to speak to the province of Quebec. But in the province of Quebec, I think generally speaking, we are known to have like fairly good access to gender affirming care, although they are mainly focused in a large city. And so people who live a little bit outside may have difficulty to kind of access it. So I'm not saying that access is without problem, but generally speaking, we've got like a good access to care, and young people are able to access to puberty blockers from the onset of puberty, and then after that they could access also to gender affirming hormones and eventually surgery if needed or wanted by the young person. Surgeries are usually not available before the age of 18, except for some exceptions, sometime with for trans boys who can, in case of like important distress, can access top surgeries a little bit earlier than 18 years old. So gender affirming care can be accessed from the onset of puberty, depending on the need of young people. We have conducted research on access and benefit of gender affirming care on trans youth in Canada. We did research following young people in clinics. So we did recruit young people who were accessing gender affirming care in Montreal, in Ottawa, and also on another site in Manitoba. And what we found out is that it was like overly very positive in terms of effect on young people. And we have noted important improvement in terms of self-assessed well-being of those young people. So when we were asking them about the impact that gender affirming care had on their well-being, most young people who participated in our study were saying that it is very beneficial. And what was also notable is that the benefit seems to also increase with the type of intervention. So blockers, you know, there were some benefit in terms of well-being, but because it did not bring any desired change, the benefit were less noted than with the hormone therapy, for example. And we had one young person in our study who had access to top surgery, and for that person, for him, it was the most beneficial intervention. So the conclusion of our study was that you know, access, early access to gender affirming care is definitely important in improving well-being of young people. We have used this protocol and have also collected data elsewhere in the world in order to try to have a look at how social context and access to care can affect young people. So we reproduced that protocol in Southern Australia, and as well as in Romandy, so French Switzerland, and in the UK. And so co-researchers, Anna Carlisle, Damien Riggs, Denise Medico, collected data among trans youth in those countries. And when we compared this data that was collected according to the same protocol, we were able to see that those young people who fared the least well are those who live in places where access to gender affirming care was constrained or difficult or impossible in the case of Switzerland at the time of the research. So again, when we look at data from Canada, but also compared to other countries, we can see that access, quick early access is quite important for young people. So if people need to have access to those articles, I would be more than happy to share them with you. In Canada, we also hear about, well, I think we notice more and more in the public discourse, some groups of people saying, well, you know, young people are so young, how can they decide? Okay, as I said, despite the evidence that we have that show that gender affirming care work and have positive effects, those discourse, I would say, tend to be more present. So in order to address that, a team in Quebec decided to look at the idea of discontinuation of transition, often also called detransition. Because basically it is a phenomenon, if I can say, that is more and more present in the public discourse, and as we see here, tend to be used to restrict access to gender affirming care. And you know, I would say a few words on what we have found so far, and these are preliminary preliminary result that we just shared with European EPAF, European Professional of Transgender Health, EPAF, yeah, European Professional Association of Transgender Health. And so that was like in Switzerland. This morning I was presenting those data. Basically what we see is that, yes, there are some young people who, after starting a transition, will decide for several type of reason, that this does not meet their need anymore, that transition, and so that they decide to discontinue with that transition. But what we see is that the current identity of young people who participated in our study is not always a return to cisgender identity. And so what we can see in that data, and is very preliminary, is that even young people who discontinue their transition, sometimes it's part of a process where they will, end up as having a different identity than the one assigned at birth. So this was like, a large proportion of our young people that we met. Of course, there are some young people that we met that also show a lot of regrets and, decided to return to their assigned gender at birth. But I think it's important to realize that this is a phenomenon that is much more complex than what we could see at first sight when we look at mainstream media. And I would say also that young people are able to both experience regret and gratitude over the process that they went through, insofar that, yes, there are some, things that they wish they did not do this way, but there's some other things that they feel they needed to do to be able to get where they are at today. And some of them don't even regret their current state, insofar that, for example, a person could have had a mastectomy, and often those young people transition when they were like late puberty, actually, and not at the beginning of the puberty. But what they say is that some of the transition that they did, for example, in the case of a mastectomy, could be today considered as still something that they feel good about. Some people will miss, though, some of their body that they change through transition. But what I'm trying to say here, in a very few words and very few time, for a very complex, circumstance, is that the question of discontinuation of transition or detransition, I think it can help us to understand better the needs of those young people, but from what we see in the data, should certainly not be used to restrict access to gender affirming care, because the situation is much more complex. And some of the young people themselves say that they would have loved to have a good accompaniment during the process of transition, and sometimes this is something that was lacking, but that they would have done it probably at this time anyway. So it's really important, I think, take out from that quick discussion on detrans, is that it's probably better to provide a good accompaniment to young people who decide to embark on transition, because it is a big decision for them to start this journey, and an accompaniment is always good. However, I think that accompaniment should be non-constraining insofar that it shouldn't be conditional to being able to access services, because what we see also is that often young people may adapt their narrative, what they're saying, to the person they work with to meet the criteria. So if you make it as a condition to be able to access something, they are likely to just embark in that narrative to prove you right, to prove them right, if I say. So, the sort, what we, I think what we're seeing from preliminary data is that accompaniment is important, but it should be non-constraining and based on really accompanying the young person to be able to see if this is definitely what they see themselves in the future, if it's something they want to go through. So that, I would say, is the takeout. I think I would say that. And if people have questions for me, please do not hesitate to email me. I will not join the live Q&A because in Canada it's going to be really, 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 really early in the morning or late in the night, depending. But I am very happy to answer questions by email if you do have some. And I can also provide with some videos of preliminary data we shared at EPAF, as well as articles that we publish on access to gender affirming care and well-being on young people. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Louis Asquith, my pronouns are they and them. I'm the Director of Legal and Policy at a charity called Mermaids, based in the United Kingdom. We at Mermaids support transgender, non-binary and gender diverse young people, as well as their family members, whatever family means to them, and professionals involved in their care up to their 20th birthday, so 19 years old and below. It's a real pleasure to be here at World Pride with you all. I know that ordinarily we would be perhaps sitting together, and that isn't happening this year, but I'm still just as fueled to be having conversations with you. I'm still just as fueled to be learning from you and speaking with you and platforming the lived experiences of LGBT people around the globe to ensure that we advance our rights and advance celebration of our experiences, and celebration being a key word that we always try and promote at Mermaids. So I'm a lawyer by background, but moved to Mermaids, moved to the third sector around 3 years ago, and I've been doing this work since. I've had the privilege of working with trans young people directly and their families throughout that time, and watched the incremental challenges that these young people and families have faced throughout that period of time also. One particular area of difficulty has been in relation to access to healthcare. So we know that specifically in the UK, there have always been, or certainly recently, in recent years, there have been challenges in respect of accessing healthcare. Waiting lists have been years for a number of years, and yet in December 2020, when we thought things couldn't get much worse, things did get worse. What happened was there was a case in the High Court, and that case was called and is called Kira Bell and the Tavistock and Portman Trust. And that case was heard last year with a decision handed down in December 2020. That decision had the effect of essentially insisting that young trans people obtained a court order before they were able to access puberty blockers. Now, of course, we know that not every trans young person requires healthcare intervention. Not every trans young person requires puberty blockers. Not every trans person requires cross-sex hormones or indeed surgery later on in life. But we know there is a population of young trans people who very much require healthcare intervention to feel comfortable in themselves and to be able to get on with their life. So adding this particular administrative and emotional milestone to the pathway, which was already very, very difficult, was a huge blow to the trans community. The case is currently being appealed, and we are waiting to hear what the decision of that appeal is. But the impact we've seen on this case has been absolutely catastrophic. The impact on mental health of both the young people and their family members is difficult to put into words, but we can all imagine having the right to make a decision about your own body, the right to decide what is right for you, to be suddenly taken away from you because you are trans. The human experience of that, I'm sure everybody can look to and empathise with. There was another case in March this year, the ABCD case, that did confirm that parents could consent on behalf of their children as a result of a case that went through the family system. However, we know that this requires somebody to have the support at home. And even though this case was decided in the way it was, we're still yet to have any progress within the pathway to actually start allowing prescriptions to recommence. To date, since the Bell decision, new prescriptions were halted, and as I say, to date, they have not been recommenced. So we're in a position whereby there is a population of young people that is in complete limbo, not knowing what is happening, what to do, not having access to treatment that they require to feel comfortable. And we're in what I would deem and what I see to be a crisis. Now, I look forward to, as I say, speaking with colleagues from around the world to reflect on the current position there, to reflect on what we can do together to try and advance the situation, to progress the situation, to ensure that everybody can receive healthcare without discrimination. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I look forward to speaking with you all.